The day before their wedding, my son-in-law looked at me and said in a voice that tried to be casual, "You should disappear." And those words settled like a stone in my chest. Where are you watching from today? Type the name of your city below, and if this story matters to you, hit subscribe so you do not miss the rest. The reception hall smelled like waxed wood and citrus. The chandelier lights hummed softly above us, and I felt the gravel of the parking lot still in my shoes as I stood in the shadow of what was supposed to be a new family beginning. He pulled me aside and smiled with teeth that did not quite reach his eyes, and everything after that night turned into a plan I had to carry out. I had known Mark for 5 years, long enough to know the cadence of his laugh and short enough to miss the small lies that would later expand into a conspiracy. My daughter Emma was radiant, hair pinned with tiny pearls, and she believed in the man she chose with a trust I would come to both admire and fear. I remember the color of the folder he held that evening, blue with a bank logo, the weight of it in his hand, the way he put it down like a casual thing, and then the sentence, "You should disappear." My voice shook. I asked, "Why would you say that to me?" He answered, "You make things complicated," and then he laughed as if it were a private joke. I said, "You are not joking." He said, "We all have to choose our battles." I said, "My daughter is not a battle." He said, "We can do this quietly." I said, "What exactly do you want me to do?" He said, "Just leave before the vows." I said, "Emma would never forgive you if she knew." He said, "She does not need to know everything." I said, "I will not be erased." He said, "Then expect consequences." I said, "I will protect her." He said, "Try," and he walked away, leaving the folder on a table like an offer and a threat at once. My palms left a faint mark on the linen, and I felt the air cool around me, as if the room itself had noticed the shift. I did not react like a person in a movie who storms into a confrontation. I sat for a long time in the car, under a roof of sweating pine, and turned the moment over until it fit into a shape I could act on. At midnight, I made the first call. I hired Jack, a private investigator who had been a cop for 20 years and who smelled faintly of coffee and old books. I called my friend Anna and asked her to be ready to take Emma for a weekend if needed. I texted my neighbor, Mrs. Morales, and asked her to keep an eye out for anything unusual around our home. I contacted attorney Lisa for a preliminary consult and asked Rachel, the wedding planner, to delay the delivery of a particular package without arousing suspicion. That night, I wrote down everything I remembered of the exchange and put the note into a small locked box in my bedside drawer. I could not sleep, but I could prepare, and preparation felt like resistance. My backstory is a folder of quiet years that built me into someone who would not be pushed aside. I grew up in a small town where the church bell was the calendar, and my mother worked 2 jobs to pay for our books. I learned early that steadiness was a kind of armor and that small details saved you more often than grand gestures. In college, I studied accounting because numbers do not lie and because they give you an edge when people try to make you vanish. I married young and became a mother at 27, and I learned the cadence of lullabies and legal forms in the same breath. Then I lost my first marriage to illness and to indifference, and that loss taught me how precarious trust can be and how important it is to guard what is yours. The job I kept for 15 years was not glamorous. I managed a community center where people left the things they wanted to forget and took home whatever dignity they could find. Those years taught me to listen to the small truths people tell in between the sentences, the ones that count. All of this mattered now because when someone told me to disappear, I had a life history that told me to gather evidence, not to flee. Jack arrived with a black notebook and a slow way of speaking that made you feel he was measuring words the way he measured facts. He and I sat at my kitchen table beneath the hum of the refrigerator and traded notes. I handed him a copy of the paper I had found slipped into our mailbox weeks before, a letter that at first seemed like an innocent invitation, but which contained account numbers and signatures that did not match the handwriting of anyone we knew. He asked me to recount every detail, and as I spoke, he wrote in block letters. The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. There was a dull ache at the base of my skull from sleepless nights. The coffee on the table steamed and tasted like something I had to force down. My fingers were always sticky with the glue of envelopes and receipts, and the clock on the oven clicked in a rhythm that seemed to count down until something else would shift. Jack said, "He will try to keep this quiet." I said, "He already tried." Jack said, "Then we will make it public." I said, "How do we do that without destroying Emma?" Jack said, "We do the math first and protect her name." I said, "She deserves to know the truth." Jack said, "We give you control over the timing." I said, "I need to know the ledger." Jack said, "I will get it." I said, "Find his bank." Jack said, "I will start there." I said, "Be discreet." Jack said, "Discretion is our currency." The plan required paperwork and procedure, and I will lay out some of the technical steps because truth has to be exact to stand up to the world. Forensics of financial records begins with a subpoena to the bank that includes precise account identifiers, the dates in question, and the signature of a court clerk to avoid any challenge to admissibility. Chain of custody procedures were followed, so each document I handed over was logged with timestamps, a witness, and a sealed envelope to prevent contamination. The forensic accountant I hired later described how they traced wire transfers through intermediary accounts following timestamps and metadata to identify a pattern of diversion. Each step was documented, and copies were kept in separate physical and digital vaults to prevent tampering. Those procedural actions were not glamorous, but they were necessary, and they would become the spine of our case. Mornings before the wedding felt like a rehearsal for a play I had not agreed to perform. The bridal suite smelled of hairspray and sugar. The dressing room lights were bright and unforgiving. Fabrics rustled like small storms, and laughter ricocheted against mirrored walls. Emma hugged me and whispered, "I am so happy," and I held her like a compass that could not be broken. Rachel, the planner, brushed imaginary dust from a chair and said, "Everything is on schedule." Carlos, the best man, joked about nerves and popped an air of mirth that did not disguise a tremor. I smiled and said, "Everything looks perfect," and under my voice I added to Jack, "Keep the line open." I moved through the morning like a woman carrying two lives, the one inside a dress and the one under the dress of paperwork and precaution. I felt the coolness of the veil between my fingers and the warmth of Emma's hand on my wrist. I tasted peppermint from a small candy someone handed me and heard the distant hum of the caterer setting tables. At one point, Mark came into the suite with a tray of glasses and a smile that felt practiced. He said, "You look beautiful," and I said, "Thank you," and he said, "This will be over soon," and I said, "Over what?" and he said, "Everything you make complicated," and I said, "I will not be made complicated away." He laughed and left as if our conversation had been nothing. The envelopes were prepared the morning of the ceremony, small cream packets sealed with a sticker, each labeled with what appeared to be "Congratulations." I had asked Rachel to keep one of the envelopes separate, which she did. Shaking her head with curiosity but without question, the reception hall smelled of cut grass and fried onions from the outside grills. The wooden floor shone under footsteps. The chandelier sparkled in white light. Music filters came through the open doors, carrying laughter and the smell of warm bread. Guests arrived in clusters, and the room filled with names and textures. Maria, my neighbor in a blue dress. Tomas, a cousin who had come from out of state. Claire, an old friend who had watched Emma grow. Pastor Henry with a small tie and a serious look. And Bruno, a colleague of Mark, who lingered near the bar. I circulated with a glass of water to keep steady, fingers tracing the rim like a metronome. When the moment came for the reading of the gifts, the officiant smiled and said, "We will open a selection of messages from loved ones," and I felt my heart cleave into two. Emma stood in white like a small sun and smiled, ready to be surprised. I had prepared a small intervention that was more about evidence than spectacle. Inside the envelope I had Rachel hold, there were photocopies of bank statements and a handwriting sample, and a sealed note addressed to Emma, which I had written with care. I asked Rachel to hand it to the officiant as part of the readings, and she hesitated, then nodded. The room quieted as clicks of shoes and the rustle of programs softened. The officiant cleared his throat and said, "We will share a message from a friend." And when he opened the envelope, the first paper he took out was a ledger photocopy. I had arranged the pages so that the numbers would be visible at the top and the name of the payee legible. For a beat, there was only the sound of a chair creaking and someone trying to breathe without making a noise. Then it was as if a different wind passed through the room. Bruno frowned and said, "What is that?" And Pastor Henry looked down and said, "That does not belong here." Claire whispered, "Emma, is it some kind of mistake?" And Maria turned pale and gripped her purse so hard the leather creased. Mark moved like a man who had been pulled on a string. He stepped forward and said, "That is private." And I said, "To whom does private belong when it robs another person?" And he said, "You have no right." And I said, "I have the right to protect my daughter." And he said, "You are making a scene." And I said, "The scene is the truth unfolding." The officiant looked to me, and I said, "Read the names and the transactions and watch the faces adjust to the ledger like a hand lifting a veil." The air smelled suddenly of lemon and old paper, and the coolness of the hall felt like the inside of a chest emptied too quickly. This was the public moment. That would change everything. The revelation played out in a heat that seemed to slow time. The photocopy showed transfers labeled as gifts, reimbursements, and consulting fees that, when examined, lined up with deposits into accounts under names that were not Mark nor Emma, but aliases controlled by associates. I had Jack on a discreet line in my ear, and he whispered details he had traced through IP logs, receipts, and a series of emails that had been cleverly masked. The room reacted like an organism. The eyes of my family narrowed fearfully, and the chatter shifted into a low hum that felt like a storm gathering. Maria stood up and said, "How could you?" And Mark said, "This is slander." And Pastor Henry asked for calm, and Claire started to cry into her program. Bruno shouted, "You are breaking a wedding." And Tomas said, "This is a setup." And Mrs. Morales stood by the back watching with a slow, steady look. I said, "Look at the dates. Watch the movement between accounts. Notice the same signature that appears slightly slanted when compared to official documents." I read aloud the numbers and the phrases, and each word landed like a small weight, and the room took measure. Mark tried to snatch the papers, and I said, "Do not touch them. You will only alter the chain of custody." He grabbed at them anyway, and Carlos stepped between us, holding a hand out like a shield. The officiant said, "Someone call security," and a server reached for his phone. I could feel Emma behind me, smaller and larger at once, and I turned to her and met her eyes and said, "I am sorry for how you find this out, but you deserve the truth." That sentence was a knife and a salve at the same time. One moment of tension unraveled slowly that day, and I will slow it down here so you can feel the way time spread out like fabric. The first pause was when the ledger was read and no one understood if the words meant legal fraud or just bad bookkeeping. The second pause was when an old photo surfaced showing Mark with a man named Victor, the same name on an alias account. And the third pause was when Emma whispered, "Why would he do this?" And everyone in the room stood still like people caught in rain. Each pause was a tightening in my throat and a widening in my resolve. The first pause lasted through 5 minutes of whispered names and shifting chairs. The second pause was full of gasps when someone named a bank and then remembered a transfer. The third pause was the longest because it was a private collapse in public, and in that silence, I promised myself I would take this to the end. Security arrived and asked us all to calm down, and the DJ lowered the music and asked that private conversations be taken outside. A police officer named Sergeant Lopez showed up with a calm procedural manner and a business card that smelled faintly of toner. He asked for statements and said, "We will need to secure those documents as evidence," and I handed him copies and kept originals stored separately with Jack. The officer explained chain of custody again and filled out a form with signatures and timestamps while I watched his pen move in slow, exact strokes. The police placed a temporary hold on the reception area and asked guests to remain for interviews, which they did with heavy faces. I answered questions about dates, amounts, and relationships, and I could hear the list of bank accounts, my voice steady because I had practiced the facts. The officer said, "We will file a formal complaint," and advised that he could not arrest without further proof, and I said, "We have proof," and he said, "We will verify with the bank." The procedure was clinical and precise, and it felt like armor. The procedural account of evidence handling is important to state clearly, so there is no mistaking the process. The officers photographed each document at the scene, logged them into evidence with barcode labels, and placed originals into secure envelopes that were sealed and signed by a detective. Chain of custody logs were maintained with timestamps and witness signatures to preserve integrity for court. Forensic accountants submitted formal reports summarizing transactions with supporting metadata and IP logs to corroborate digital transfers. Subpoenas were issued to intermediary banks to obtain full records and to social platforms to retrieve messages. These steps turned a messy human betrayal into an organized file that could be presented with authority. After the initial fallout, I was contacted by 2 reporters, and I declined to speak on camera because the legal process had to be respected. The community divided quickly into conversations at kitchen tables and messages in neighborhood groups. Mrs. Morales texted me, "Stay strong," and brought over a pot of soup that smelled like cumin and comfort. Tomas argued with Bruno, who insisted there had to be an explanation. Claire sat with Emma and held her hands in a way that made the bones feel like a map. I received a call from Lisa, the attorney, who advised on the immediate steps to file civil claims to freeze assets and to request temporary protective orders to prevent any transfer of funds. We filed an emergency motion that included the chain of custody logs and the forensic accounting summary. The court clerk assigned a judge, and the clerk number blinked on the screen like an appointment with fate. In the weeks that followed, Jack uncovered more threads. He found emails that connected Mark to a small consultancy that existed only on paper and to a shell company with registered agents in another state. He traced travel receipts that did not match Mark's stated work trips and found witness statements from a former employee named Luis who said he had been asked to open accounts. Jack fed me details with the rhythm of small reveals because he knew how dangerous a full disclosure could be before the law was ready. I learned the names of accomplices, Victor, Bruno, and Sandra, and discovered that several transactions had been routed through accounts tied to a foundation that had a noble-sounding name but an empty mission statement. The discovery of these names allowed Lisa to draft expanded litigation documents charging fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy. The investigation revealed the backstory of Mark that I had not known entirely at the beginning. He had once worked at a marketing firm where he learned how to structure payments and to obscure trails through layers of subcontracting. He had a habit of charming people into trusting him for reasons that looked like skill but were actually manipulation. In his 20s, he had been convicted of petty fraud in another state for falsifying invoices and served a short sentence, which he always explained away as youthful mistake. That file was uncovered by Jack and corroborated by a court clerk in the previous jurisdiction. The pattern grew into a map, a trail of small deceptions plotted across years and cities that, when connected, formed a conspiracy that ate into the finances of several families. Names of victims emerged, and we began to contact them, carefully preparing witness statements and organizing their testimonies through Lisa, who coordinated affidavits and depositions. Protecting Emma remained my priority, and we built a buffer between her and any direct contact from Mark while legal measures took effect. Negotiations began through attorneys, and we were offered hush money with a request for a non-disclosure agreement that would have effectively erased the ledger from public view. I refused. We were offered an amount that would have settled immediate claims, but that would not have uncovered the network. I said, we will not be silenced for money, and Lisa said, that is wise, because hush money would only allow them to rebuild. We prepared for litigation and for a public unmasking, because justice, in our view, required accountability, not silence. Meanwhile, Jack arranged a controlled meeting, a sting, where we could present incontrovertible proof to a neutral party and record responses. The idea was to create a situation where Mark would incriminate himself or offer admissions that would be admissible. The final confrontation took place in a meeting room on a gray Tuesday with 2 attorneys, 2 investigators, and a court reporter present. The room smelled of new paint and coffee. The fluorescent lights were steady and unforgiving. The table was cool under our hands, and the clock ticked with a steady nearness to judgment. The dialogue that followed was measured and long, and I will reproduce it because the exchange demonstrates the shift from evasion to exposure. I said, we have the bank records and the email chain. And Mark said, those are forgeries. And Lisa said, we verified them with the issuing institutions. And Mark said, you cannot prove intent. And Jack said, intent is shown by the pattern of repeated transactions. And Mark said, you are making assumptions. And I said, look at the names and dates. And Mark said, you are only seeing what you want to see. And Jack said, then explain the intermediary accounts. And Mark said, those were loans. And Lisa said, show signed loan agreements. And Mark said, I do not have to present anything now. And I said, you did not expect us to find everything. And Mark said, you are ruining lives. And I said, ruining is different from revealing. And the court reporter typed, and the devices recorded, and each denial became thinner. That exchange went back and forth with 8 long turns from each party. And at the end, Mark flinched when we produced a ledger that matched a series of power of attorney documents in a different county. He had no prepared answer for that, and his composure slipped. A second moment of tension occurred when the attorneys asked for an explanation of a wire transfer that occurred on a date Mark claimed he was at a conference. A travel receipt surfaced showing a different city, and the video from a hotel lobby showed him signing with the same name as on a delivery manifest. The contrast between what he claimed and what evidence proved was stark, and the room felt like a courtroom already. That moment stretched about 5 minutes, and in it, Mark's face registered the realization that the scaffolding of his stories had holes. He tried to recover, but the offer came too late. A third moment of tension followed when a voicemail from Victor was played, a recording obtained legally that included a suspicious instruction to move funds. The tape was short and plain, and it sounded like the crackle of someone who did not expect to be heard. And within a minute, the air grew heavy, and Mark pounded the table with his fist once, like a man who had been caught in a splintering lie. That sound echoed in my chest, and I felt both vindication and a new ache because of the publicness of it. Following the sting, the police moved quickly. Detective Alvarez took the lead and executed warrants at 2 addresses simultaneously, securing computers, phones, and hard copies of documents, which were photographed, logged, and placed into evidence bags. He described the process in careful terms, which I recorded for later court filings. Arrests were made days later when sufficient probable cause had been established. Mark was detained and charged with fraud, conspiracy, and theft by deception. Bruno was picked up in another county, and Victor was located through an IP trail and detained for questioning. The news spread in our community, and reactions ranged from disbelief to relief. Some friends expressed sorrow for the family that was breaking, and others sent messages of condolences. Support. Emma stood quietly through the first arraignment, and afterwards we sat in the car where she cried and said, I never imagined this. And I said, I know, and I promised her that we would get through it. The legal procedures that followed required precision. The prosecution filed formal indictments and included forensic accounting reports that detailed each transaction with supporting bank records and witness affidavits. Each piece of physical evidence was cataloged with barcoded tags and entered into the court system with metadata to establish provenance. Subpoenas to social platforms produced additional messages that corroborated emails. Depositions were scheduled and witness lists were prepared with full disclosure to both sides. Pretrial motions were argued over weeks, and Judge Herrera set a timetable for discovery. These procedural steps created a scaffolding for accountability, and they also meant living with uncertainty for months at a time. 1 month after the revelation, the community was still buzzing, but things had begun to settle into a new reality. Emma had returned to work and found small comforts in routine. Mrs. Morales brought casseroles, and neighbors sent notes. The court issued a temporary restraining order preventing any transfer of remaining assets and opened an inquiry into the shell companies. A support group formed online for people affected by financial con artists, and Claire moderated the first meeting. I started meeting with other mothers who had been blindsided by family fraud, and we began to compile resources on who to contact when trust turned predatory. That month felt like shaking hands on a wound you could not see but could feel. 3 months after the arrests, depositions had unfolded, and the prosecution had filed additional charges against 2 accomplices. Civil suits to recover assets were underway, and we secured a temporary freeze on several accounts. We launched a small community fund to support victims who needed help to recover legal fees, an idea that began as a spreadsheet and grew into a tiny formal nonprofit registered with the state. The nonprofit got its first donation from Claire and from a retired judge named Alan who believed in accountability and who agreed to mentor our board. Emma volunteered with the nonprofit in a small way, offering to meet others who had been betrayed, and her courage in showing up became an inspiration to others. 6 months later, there was a sentencing hearing that felt like a plateau of justice. Mark pled guilty to several counts in a plea agreement that included restitution and a suspended sentence contingent on prison time if terms were violated. Bruno received a sentence of 3 years, and Victor accepted a deal to testify against other parties in exchange for a reduced sentence. The nonprofit we formed had a modest but steady stream of donors, and we had started a hotline staffed by volunteers to help people identify red flags such as sudden secrecy, changes in financial documents, and unexplained transfers. We launched a short guide called Protecting Families from Financial Betrayal with links to legal aid and resources, and within months it had been downloaded hundreds of times. We also created a petition that urged local banks to strengthen verification protocols for transfers, and it gained traction among community leaders and several local politicians who promised to review current procedures. The legacy of this episode was not merely legal outcomes. It became the seed of a project that turned harm into prevention. 5 names emerged as crucial in this process. Jack, the investigator who kept me level and diligent. Lisa, the attorney who navigated the courts. Rachel, the planner who followed my requests despite risk. Mrs. Morales, the neighbor who kept watch. And Claire, the friend who helped Emma through the most private moments. Their actions and sacrifices made the difference between a private calamity and public accountability. In the end, the documents that were meant to hide wrongdoing became tools for exposure. The fraud was named, the manipulation was called out, and the people complicit paid a price. If you have ever felt erased by someone you trusted, you know how lonely it can feel. If you have ever woken to the sense that a life you built can be quietly dismantled, this story is for you. Tell me in the comments the city you are watching from, and in one word, choose how you would react: perdonaria, exporia, or seiria. Your answers help others see they are not alone and guide the stories we bring next. We are building a community that supports survivors, offers resources, and presses institutions to strengthen protections. Your comment could be the reason someone finds the courage to check a bank statement, to ask a question, to save themselves. To anyone listening who wonders whether truth is worth the price, the answer I offer is that truth costs, but silence costs more. We rebuild not by revenge, but by gathering facts, by enlisting professionals, and by turning an ugly betrayal into a lesson for others. There are practical steps if you find yourself in a similar storm. Document everything, keep originals and copies in separate places, secure legal counsel, and consider a trusted investigator to trace financial trails. Protect the younger and more fragile members of your family with temporary distance and clear communication, and build a plan that prioritizes safety and evidence over immediate forgiveness. The community we created has resources for people who need help, and that is the way our pain found purpose. If you want more stories like this and want to learn how to protect yourself from fraud's emotional and financial hit, hit subscribe. We post investigative guides, interviews with forensic accountants and legal experts, and we share survivor stories so you can learn the signs and know you are not alone. Share this video with someone who might need it and leave a comment below. Sometimes the person trying to erase you is the person who most needs to be seen. If you want to help support our hotline for victims, there is a link in the description. Remember that truth is a kind of light, and when it is applied carefully, it cuts through the darkest disguises. Sometimes the person who tells you to disappear is the one who will be seen to answer for what they did, and sometimes that visibility is the only justice that remains. Thank you for listening, stay safe, and take care of each other.